The snow did not fall so much as it pressed itself against the earth, thick and relentless, a curtain that erased the line between sky and ground. Evelyn Harper staggered forward, shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, her breath breaking in ragged bursts of vapor. Behind her, lantern light dwindled, a faint glow carried by the wagons that had left her. Wheels creaking, horses snorting, men calling to one another as they pushed on without her. Their voices faded until there was only the groan of wind, and the hollow thud of her boots sinking into drifts. She knew better than to cry. Tears froze too quickly, salt against skin. But more than that, she would not give them the satisfaction, even in memory. The settlers had not looked back when they cast her aside. Not one. They had muttered of curses, of sickness that clung to her like a shadow. One man had said she drew misfortune the way iron drew lightning. Another, louder than the rest, had spat that she was no fit wife, no fit companion, not even fit to share a wagon bench. She had watched the women turn their eyes away, skirts brushing against her like judgment made of cloth. The world had narrowed to this, the snowstorm swallowing her, the endless whiteness, the gnawing truth that no one would come back. Her legs ached with a limp she could not hide, her ankle twisted from years past when a horse had thrown her. That flaw had always followed her, as visible as her pale face, as damning as her solitude. The storm thickened until it seemed alive, howling, grasping, tugging at her skirt and hair. She pressed onward, though she no longer knew where she was headed. The horizon was gone, erased. Trees blurred into shadows. Each step grew heavier, her body leaden, her mind spinning with the memory of the railway station weeks before. The crowded room lit by weak lanterns, the stove glowing red, the air sour with tobacco smoke and wet wool. Men had come to claim women for wives, or labor, or simply company on the road west. Evelyn had sat, shawl pulled close, hands folded in her lap, waiting. One by one, others were chosen. A girl with flaxen hair was lifted onto a wagon bench, kissed roughly on the cheek. A widow with 2 children was given a place near the fire. Evelyn had waited, heart thudding, until the room grew empty save for her and the shopkeeper's wife, who had shaken her head with pity sharp as knives. "Not you," she had whispered, "not cruel, only certain. Not with your limp, not with your family's grave still fresh. Men don't want a reminder of death." The shame of that night clung to Evelyn now as fiercely as the snow. She stumbled, dropping to her knees, the cold piercing through fabric into bone. Her fingers trembled as she clawed at the drift, forcing herself upright. If she lay down, the storm would bury her, and no one would find her come spring. She thought of her mother's voice, hushed and warm, once telling her that every life was worth more than the world's cruelty. She thought of her father's hand, rough but steady on hers, before fever took him. They were gone, all of them gone, and the town had whispered that she was marked, that misfortune had spared her only to linger over her like smoke. The sky above was iron. Snowflakes clung to her lashes until her vision blurred. She pushed forward, but her legs betrayed her again, buckling. She fell hard, cheek striking ice, breath knocked from her chest. For a moment she lay still, her pulse thundering in her ears, the storm muffling everything. She whispered then, voice raw, "Just a little warmth. Just a little." The world tilted. Sound dulled. She thought she saw a figure moving through the storm, tall, dark against the white, but her mind, desperate for mercy, might have conjured it. She closed her eyes, ready to sink into the quiet. Then the cold shifted. Not vanished, but changed, cut by heat. A shadow bent over her, vast, blocking the wind. She felt arms, strong, calloused, lift her as though she weighed no more than a child. Her eyes fluttered open, lashes wet with frost. A face loomed close, features sharpened by firelight in her fading vision. High cheekbones, hair black as the raven's wing, chest bare despite the storm, muscles carved by a life she could not imagine. His gaze was steady, dark as the storm's center, not unkind, not pitying, only certain. Evelyn tried to speak, to ask who he was, but her lips froze against the words. The man said nothing. Snow swirled around them, a halo of white, as he shifted her weight against him, wrapping a fur cloak across her trembling body. Her head pressed against the solid warmth of his shoulder, and for the first time since the wagons abandoned her, She felt the ache of survival rather than the certainty of death. She clutched weakly at the fur, her fingers brushing his skin. Heat radiated from him like a fire unburned by wind. Her mind flickered with fear. He was Apache, the kind her people whispered about with dread, but the storm had stripped her of choice. She could not walk, could not fight. She could only let herself be carried. His stride was steady, unhurried, as though the blizzard bent around him rather than hindered him. Each step broke the snow, each breath a mist that mingled with hers. Evelyn's eyes half closed, her heartbeat slowing. She felt the rhythm of his chest, the weightless sway of being borne through the storm. Darkness pressed at the edges of her sight, but before it swallowed her, she heard his voice, a whisper, low and resonant, carrying a meaning that struck through the haze of cold. The words were not the harsh syllables she had been taught to fear, but soft, almost reverent, as if spoken to the storm itself. Evelyn did not understand the language, not fully. Yet she felt the weight of it, the intent. She caught the faint shape of English folded into the sound. One phrase clear enough to pierce the veil of snow. "I chose you." Her breath hitched, though her body was weak. She could not answer, could not comprehend why or how, only that those words would cling to her as fiercely as the storm. His arms tightened, carrying her forward into a darkness that smelled of smoke and pine and fire waiting beyond the gale. The snow raged, but within it, Evelyn Harper was no longer alone. Evelyn woke to the crackle of fire, and the smell of smoke rich with pine resin. Her body, still wrapped in furs, felt half hers and half some fragile vessel returned from the edge of death. She did not know how long she had slept. The storm still whispered against the walls of the lodge, but here the air was warm, touched by flame and shadow. She lay still at first, eyes roaming the dim interior. Wooden beams arched above her like ribs of some ancient creature. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, their silhouettes swaying with the draft. A bough and quiver leaned against the wall. Skins and pelts softened the ground, layered thick enough that her body no longer shivered. The silence pressed close, broken only by the steady crackle of fire, and the low whistle of wind beyond the door. Then she saw him. The man who had carried her through the storm sat cross-legged by the fire, shirtless still, as though the cold had no claim on him. His broad back gleamed in the firelight, muscles shifting with each motion of his hand as he carved at a strip of wood with a knife. His hair fell loose over his shoulders, black as the raven's wing. He did not look at her, though she knew he was aware she had stirred. There was something in his stillness that told her he missed nothing. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Fear, yes, but not the kind she had known from townsfolk's scorn or settlers' abandonment. This was different. Fear braided with awe, with the raw strangeness of being seen alive when she should have been frozen under snow. She sat up slowly, clutching the fur tighter around her, her breath uneven. "You," her voice rasped. The word frayed against the quiet, too fragile to hold. At last he turned his head. His eyes met hers across the fire, dark and steady, reflecting flame. For a heartbeat she thought he might speak, might offer some word to steady the strange trembling inside her. But he said nothing. Instead, he rose with a grace that seemed impossible for his size, and moved to the pot suspended over the fire. He ladled broth into a carved wooden bowl, the steam curling upward like a prayer. Without a word, he carried it to her and set it within her reach. The gesture was simple, yet it shook her more than any threat. She looked from the bowl to him, then back again, fingers tightening on the fur as though it were her last defense. Still, hunger gnawed at her. She reached for the bowl, her hands trembling. The first sip burned her tongue but spread warmth down her throat, filling the hollow that fear had left behind. She had not realized how starved she was until now. Tears pricked her eyes, unbidden, and she turned her face away so he would not see. But when she glanced back, his gaze was fixed on her, unreadable, neither pity nor scorn. Simply watching. Why? The question slipped from her before she could bite it back. Her voice wavered. Why did you bring me here? He did not answer. He only crouched near the fire again, the flames casting long shadows across the planes of his chest and shoulders. He set down the knife and wood, folding his hands as though content to let silence stretch forever. Evelyn's throat tightened. The settler's words still rang inside her, cursed, unfit, left behind. She wondered if he had saved her only to mock her with the same truth. Yet there was no mockery in him, only a calm that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She forced herself to eat, spoonful by spoonful, until the bowl was empty. Each mouthful anchored her more firmly in the world. When she set the bowl aside, she noticed her boots by the fire, leather split from the storm. They had been stitched with fresh sinew, clumsy yet strong. Her breath caught. He had done it while she slept. The shame of it stung as much as gratitude. She was no one to him, an abandoned girl, half dead in the snow, yet he had mended what was broken without a word. The settlers had not spared her a glance, but this man, stranger though he was, had bent to repair what others cast off. Her hands trembled as she brushed the fur from her lap and stood, unsteady. The limp in her step betrayed her immediately. She cursed it under her breath, heat rising to her face. But before she could stumble, his hand was there, broad, scarred, steady under her arm. She froze at the touch, heart hammering. The world narrowed to the warmth of his palm against her, the quiet strength that asked nothing yet gave everything in its steadiness. He did not tighten his grip, did not pull her closer, only braced her until her balance returned. Then, as silently as he had offered it, he let go. Evelyn lowered her gaze, her throat thick. No one had touched her like that in years, not with patience, not with care stripped of demand. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something that would loosen the ache lodged in her chest. But the words tangled inside her. Outside, the storm's howl lessened, as though the night itself leaned closer to listen. Evelyn returned to the fur bedding, folding herself small, her mind a storm louder than the one beyond the door. She thought of the town, of Margaret Pike's sharp tongue, of the way Caleb Rourke had looked through her as though she were smoke. And now here she was, sheltered by the man she had been taught to fear, his silence a kind of mercy she did not know how to bear. The fire dimmed to embers. Evelyn's eyes grew heavy, though sleep was restless. Somewhere between waking and dreams, she heard him move again. His steps were light, deliberate. She dared to open her eyes just enough to see him at the doorway, gazing out at the storm as if keeping watch. His profile was carved by shadow and flame, steady as stone. The wind wailed, and in it she thought she heard him speak. Not loud, not for her, but to the night itself. His voice was low, resonant, carrying words she could not understand. Yet within the foreign syllables, she caught a thread, fragile but unmistakable, in her own tongue. "You are not cursed." Her breath caught, sharp as a blade. She shut her eyes quickly, afraid he would see that she had heard, that the words had cut deeper than any insult ever had. She held them inside her like contraband, warm against the cold of all she had carried before. The lodge settled into silence again, save for the steady rhythm of his breathing, the fire sighing low. Evelyn clutched the fur close, her heart alive with a tremor she could not name. She had been saved, yes, but more than that, she had been seen, and the weight of that truth was heavier than the storm. When the snow softened into slush and the days stretched pale with thaw, Evelyn knew she could not remain hidden in the shelter of fire and furs. Survival demanded flour, kerosene, salt, things only town could provide. She dreaded it, but dread had never stopped hunger. Taza said nothing when she gathered her shawl. He simply rose, pulled on his leggings and stepped into the cold. He carried no weapon but himself, and that was enough. Evelyn followed, her limp dragging shame across the frozen earth. Their footprints trailed behind them like a secret too bold to be kept. The town appeared with the stubbornness of wood and stone against the prairie's vastness. Smoke from chimneys curled upward, gray against the sky. As they walked the main street, silence spread like frost before them. Men paused in their labor, women drew children close. The clang of a hammer in the smithy faltered, then fell still. Evelyn felt every eye on her, felt her breath shorten, until each step seemed a sentence pronounced. Margaret Pike emerged from the mercantile door, apron dusted with flour. Her lips curved into a smile that was no smile at all. "Well," she called, her voice sharp enough to cut cloth, "the cursed girl returns. And look who brings her back, a savage in place of a savior." The words rippled through the gathered crowd, soft laughter swelling behind gloved hands. Evelyn's stomach knotted. Her cheeks burned hotter than the fire she had left behind in Taza's lodge. She lowered her gaze, willing herself invisible. But Taza did not bow his head. He stood beside her as if the stares meant nothing, as if their whispers were wind to be endured. His silence was not submission but defiance, stillness sharpened into strength. Evelyn felt it radiate from him, and against her will, some of that steadiness seeped into her bones. They entered the mercantile. The air inside smelled of molasses and dried beans, heavy with judgment. Margaret waited behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "What is it you think you'll buy here?" she asked, her tone mocking. "We sell to respectable folk, not cursed strays clinging to heathens." Evelyn's lips trembled as she forced her voice forward. "Flour. Salt. Kerosene." The words were small, but they stood. She placed coins on the counter, her hand shaking. For a moment, Margaret did not move. Then, with a sharp laugh, she shoved the coins back toward Evelyn. "Money's not the only price," she sneered. "Respect, reputation, you've none left." Evelyn's throat closed. She wanted to flee, to vanish back into the storm where whispers could not reach. But before she could turn, Taza stepped forward. He said nothing, only took the coins from Evelyn's hand and set them on the counter again. His eyes met Margaret's with the weight of mountains. No threat, no plea, only certainty. The room held its breath. Margaret's smile faltered. She looked away first. With a mutter, she gathered the goods and shoved them across the counter. The sack of flour was heavier than Evelyn could manage, her ankle twisting as she tried to lift it. She staggered. Before shame could engulf her, Taza's hand was there, steady, lifting the burden with ease. He carried it as though it were air, his silence louder than any boast. As they left, Evelyn heard the whispers rising again, louder now, crueler. "She's ruined. Doesn't even belong to her own kind. Marked woman." Each word sank like a stone, but Taza's stride did not falter. Evelyn matched his pace, her chin trembling but lifted higher than before. Outside, Caleb Rourke leaned against a post, hat tipped low, mouth twisted in disdain. Once, she had thought he might choose her, before he laughed in her face at the station, before he turned his back like the rest. Now his gaze slid past her to Taza, cold with contempt. "You picked up what we left to die," Caleb said, his voice carrying for all to hear. "A man who takes spoiled goods is no better than spoiled himself." He spat in the snow at Taza's feet. The street went still. Evelyn's heart pounded, shame scorching her from scalp to heel. She waited for Taza to strike, to let violence bloom in the cold air. But he did not move. His silence deepened, his stillness unshaken. Evelyn felt something shift within her, a breaking and a binding at once. She stepped closer, fingers brushing his arm. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it carried the weight of choice. She chose his side, the quiet mountain over the sneering crowd. Caleb's sneer faltered at the sight, though he quickly covered it with laughter that rang hollow in the frozen street. They walked on, leaving the whispers behind, though Evelyn knew they would grow like weeds in her absence. Each step felt both heavier and lighter, the shame pressing her down, the defiance lifting her. She glanced at Taza, his profile calm against the pale sky, and felt the stirrings of something she had not known since childhood. Belonging. When they reached the edge of town, the road stretching back toward wilderness, Evelyn stopped. Her breath smoked in the air, her hands tight around the shawl at her throat. "They'll never let me belong," she whispered, the words trembling free. "Not here, not with them." Taza turned his gaze on her then, steady, unreadable. The silence stretched until it seemed it might break her. But within it, she felt his answer, not in words, but in the unwavering presence that had carried her through snow and scorn alike. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from the town. Evelyn's stomach clenched. She thought of Margaret's sneer, of Caleb's spit darkening the snow. The weight of their judgment pressed heavy. Yet beneath it stirred something new, fragile but alive, as if each cruel word had failed to bury what Taza's silence had already planted. They walked again, the sack of flour slung over his shoulder, her step uneven but unbroken. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the horizon, where storm clouds gathered once more. She felt the raw ache of being seen and scorned, but also the unexpected strength of standing beside someone who did not flinch. As the first flakes began to fall, she heard it, the whisper of town gossip carried by wind, calling her cursed. She closed her eyes, bracing for the familiar burn of shame. Instead, she felt Taza's arm brush hers, steady as the earth. The storm thickened, swallowing the road behind them. Evelyn opened her eyes to the snow ahead, her heart beating with a tremor of defiance she had not known before. And though the world would name her ruined, she carried one truth against it. She was no longer alone. The snow had not relented, though now it fell in gentler sheets, a hush that softened the world. Evelyn found herself once more within the quiet walls of Taza's lodge, the fire breathing warmth across the firs. Days bled into nights with a rhythm she had never known before, work, silence, and the strange safety of his nearness. She mended what she could, sewing small tears and pelts with hands that trembled less each day. Her stitches were uneven, but Taza never corrected her. He only passed her the bone needle, his fingers brushing hers with the kind of patience that unsettled her more than scorn ever had. Each touch was fleeting, yet lingered as if it had carved itself into her skin. Outside, she could hear the town even when it lay miles behind. The voices of Margaret Pike and Caleb Rourke clung to her memory like burrs, their words echoing whenever she closed her eyes. Cursed, spoiled, ruined. Shame pressed against her ribs like iron bands. And yet in this place, under the steady weight of Taza's silence, the shame began to loosen. One evening, as dusk deepened and the storm hummed low against the walls, Evelyn ventured to the doorway. Snow drifted high along the ground, the sky painted in shades of violet and ash. She leaned on the frame, her limp slowing her steps, but she refused to hide it now. The world had already seen her broken. Here, she wanted only to stand. Taza appeared beside her, his presence filling the space without effort. He looked at the horizon with eyes that seemed carved from the same stone as the hills. For a long while, neither spoke. Then, with a quietness that startled her, Evelyn said, "They will never forgive me for surviving." Taza turned his gaze to her, his face unreadable in the fading light. He did not answer, but she felt the weight of his regard settle over her like a cloak. She dropped her eyes, ashamed of her own voice, ashamed of needing an answer at all. But when his hand lifted the fur tighter around her shoulders, she knew his silence carried more than words ever could. The days grew longer. Evelyn began to walk with him into the woods, gathering firewood, learning which tracks in the snow belonged to hare, which to fox. Her breath caught each time his arm steadied her over drifts. Once, when she slipped on ice, her hand fell against his chest, bare beneath the winter sky. The heat of him shocked her, the steady thunder of his heart beneath her palm stronger than any words of reassurance. She pulled back quickly, cheeks flushed, but his eyes held hers with a stillness that left her unmoored. At night, she lay awake, watching the fire fade to embers, hearing the shift of his breath as he slept. She told herself it was gratitude that tightened her chest, gratitude for life itself. But gratitude did not explain the ache that deepened when his hand brushed hers, nor the way her pulse leapt when his gaze lingered across the fire. The gossip did not fade. Travelers carried whispers to the lodge, that Evelyn had been taken by a savage, that she was no longer fit to be seen among them. Margaret Pike's voice, sharp as flint, carried on the wind. "She is lost and better lost." Each word might have broken her once, but now they pressed against something harder, forged in the quiet with Taza. Still, fear grew in her, a storm inside fiercer than any blizzard. She wondered what she was to him, pity, burden, or something unspoken. She could not ask. Words felt too fragile to carry such weight. Yet each silence between them filled with questions she could not quiet. One night, when the wind howled like wolves and the fire burned low, Evelyn found herself sewing by the hearth. Taza sat across from her, mending an arrow shaft. Shadows flickered along the walls, weaving them together in flame and darkness. Her hands faltered. The needle pricked her finger, a bead of blood rising red against pale skin. She gasped softly. Before she could press the wound, Taza reached across the space and caught her hand. His fingers dwarfed hers, rough yet careful, as though even her smallest wound mattered. He held it for a moment, thumb brushing the drop away, his gaze steady on hers. The air thickened, the storm outside dimming before the storm between them. Evelyn's breath quickened, her chest tight with 1,000 unsaid words. But he released her hand without a sound. He returned to his work as though nothing had passed between them. Evelyn sat still, her heart thundering, her blood burning where his touch had lingered. She bent back over her sewing, though the thread blurred through tears she did not understand. The days after carried a tension she could not name. Each gesture grew heavier, the way he lifted the flour sack without asking, the way she reached instinctively for his arm in snow, the way their shoulders brushed as they worked beside the fire. Each act was small, yet together they swelled like a river under ice, waiting for spring to break it open. Then came the news. A traveler stopped at the lodge, a man Evelyn recognized from town. He glanced at her with pity sharpened into cruelty. "They're planning something," he said. "Caleb and the others. Say your Apache is a threat. Say he's bewitched you. They'll come before long." The man left, his words heavy as stones. Evelyn stood in the doorway long after he was gone, the storm outside mirroring the storm within. Fear twisted with fury in her chest. Fury at Caleb, at Margaret, at the whole town that would rather see her dead in the snow than alive beside Taza. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "They mean to drive you out. Maybe worse." Taza's expression did not change. He set aside the bow he had been stringing, his movements calm, unhurried. The firelight caught his face, shadows cutting across his cheekbones. He looked at her, steady, as though her fear was a storm he would stand against without moving. Evelyn's breath shook. She wanted to tell him to run, to hide, to do anything but face them. Yet the words tangled in her throat. She realized, with a jolt, that she was not only afraid of what they might do to him, she was afraid of losing him. Snow battered the door, rattling the wood like fists. Evelyn stepped closer to the fire, her shawl clutched tight. She met his gaze and for the first time, did not look away. "Promise me," she whispered, voice raw with the storm inside. "Promise me you won't let them take you." His silence deepened, thick as the snow outside. He moved toward her slowly, until the fire's glow spilled across his chest, his shadow covering hers. His eyes held hers, unblinking, and for a moment, the storm inside her stilled. Then, in a voice low as thunder beneath mountains, he spoke at last. "I do not run." The storm broke in the night, not with silence but with shouts and fire. Evelyn woke to the flicker of torchlight cutting through the cracks of the lodge walls, the sound of boots crunching snow and voices sharp with rage. Her heart lurched as she pulled the fur around her shoulders, her breath shallow. Outside, the wind carried Caleb Rourke's voice, bitter and loud. "Come out, savage. We won't have you bewitching our women." Taza stood already, his bow laid aside, his broad shoulders outlined by firelight. His face was calm, carved into stillness, but Evelyn felt the weight of danger pressing against the lodge like the storm itself. She rose, trembling, and stepped to the doorway. Through the gap, she saw them. 6 men with rifles and torches, Caleb at their head, Margaret Pike lurking behind with her eyes alight, feeding the fire with her silence. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She knew what they meant to do, and fear gripped her like ice. Yet when she turned to Taza, his expression did not falter. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the snow with the same calm as if walking into morning. Evelyn followed, though her knees shook, her limp dragging each step. She would not let him stand alone. The cold bit at her skin, sharper than knives. Flames from the torches painted the snow red, shadows twisting on the drifts. Caleb sneered when he saw her. "So it's true," he spat. "The cursed girl's gone over to him. You'll regret it, Evelyn." She flinched at his words, but Taza's presence steadied her. He stood tall, shirtless despite the cold, his chest rising slow, his silence a defiance greater than any shout. The men shifted uneasily, their rifles wavering though no weapon was raised against them. The strength in his stillness made their noise seem small, their fury hollow. Caleb stepped forward, torch in hand, his mouth twisted. "You think you can shame us with your silence? You think you can take what's ours?" His gaze snapped to Evelyn. "And you, worthless, cursed thing, you'd rather lie with him than stand with your own kind?" The word sliced, but Evelyn felt something inside her snap. Not in weakness, but in defiance. For too long she had bowed her head beneath their judgment, let their scorn bury her. No more. Her voice broke through the night, trembling yet fierce. I'd rather stand with him in the snow than with you in the light. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling. Margaret's lips thinned, her eyes darting. Caleb's face darkened, rage twisting him. He raised his torch higher. Then you're both done here. The moment hung, brittle as glass. Evelyn's breath caught, waiting for violence to break. But Taza stepped forward, closing the space between himself and Caleb. He moved without haste, without threat, yet with such certainty that Caleb faltered. The torch shook in his hand. Taza said nothing. He simply looked at the man, his gaze unflinching, and in that silence lay the weight of something no rifle could match. The men shifted, unease thickening. Sheriff Amos Grady, standing at the edge, lowered his gun slowly. His voice carried low but steady. Enough, Caleb. This ain't justice. This is pride. Caleb's eyes darted to the sheriff, then back to Taza, then to Evelyn. He saw her hand slip into Taza's, her chin lifted despite her trembling. The sight struck him harder than any blow. His sneer faltered, his grip loosening on the torch. With a curse, he flung it into the snow, the flames sputtering and dying. One by one, the others followed, muttering, their fury drained by something they could not name. Margaret hissed at them, urging, but the sheriff's glare silenced her. The crowd broke apart, their torches dimming, their footsteps retreating into the storm until only silence remained. Evelyn stood frozen, breath ragged, her hand still clutched in Taza's. The night was vast around them, the snow unbroken save for the tracks of retreating men. She felt her body tremble with fear and with something fiercer, relief, defiance, the raw pulse of having spoken at last. Taza turned to her then. For the first time, his hand tightened around hers, not as restraint but as recognition. She met his eyes, dark and steady, and saw there not possession, not pity, but a choice, a reflection of the words he had whispered when he first carried her through the storm. I chose you. The world hushed, as though even the wind leaned closer to listen. Evelyn's breath caught, her chest rising sharp with the weight of his words. And in that silence, she found her answer. Her voice was soft, but it carried against the snow. And I choose you. The storm eased, flakes drifting slow as feathers. The fire from the lodge glowed warm, and for the first time in her memory, Evelyn did not bow her head against the world. She stood with him, unashamed. Her limp no longer a mark of ruin, but a step toward something unbroken. They returned to the lodge, the door closing behind them, the night outside vast but no longer empty. Evelyn sat by the fire, her shawl falling loose from her shoulders, her hands steady. The silence between them was full now, not hollow, woven with the threads of survival, defiance, and something new that glowed like the embers at their feet. She knew the town would not forgive easily. Gossip would linger, scorn would remain. But she also knew it no longer defined her. The storm inside had broken, not into ruin but into strength, and she was no longer the girl left to die in the snow. She was the woman who had chosen to stand, and the man beside her had stood with her. The fire crackled, casting shadows that drew them together on the wall. Evelyn leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his, her breath unsteady but free. His hand found hers, fingers curling slow, deliberate. She did not look away this time. And if the world beyond the snow called her cursed still, let it. She had found her answer here, in the storm's heart, in the silence that spoke louder than any judgment. So when the night settled into quiet, Evelyn let her eyes close, her head resting against him, her voice a whisper only the fire heard. Not cursed. Chosen. The flames hissed low, the storm soft as a sigh. Outside, tracks in the snow marked the path of those who had come to break them. Inside, two shadows leaned together, unbroken, a promise written not in words but in the silence of survival. And to those who would listen, the lesson was clear as the snow itself, that love is not the absence of storms, but the strength to endure them together.